Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in today's 492nd webinar, Writing Winning Grant Proposals for a Regional Preventive Crime Gun Strategy. Now, during our webinar today, which is brought to the Justice Clearinghouse audience by Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology, Jim Needles and Karen Ziegler will discuss relevant and upcoming crime gun related initiatives and programs and explain the core processes for writing a successful grant. Specifically, they will discuss how to find appropriate grants for your organization and its needs, the basic components of a grant, and the mechanics of developing a winning proposal, how to back time the grant writing process so you can ensure you meet all of the requirements commonly stated in the grant notice, and the best ways to gain support for your grant from key constituents and stakeholders. Our first presenter is Jim Needles, who is a Forensic Intelligence Strategy Manager with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. After 28 years of service, Jim recently retired from the ATF and began his work with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. He began his ATF career as a street agent in Chicago and was then assigned to the Office of Inspections before assignments as an ASEC in the New York, Phoenix, and Chicago field divisions. Jim was also a Chief Firearms Operation Division, having national oversight of the Niben Branch Firearms Trafficking Branch at the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Diversion Branch. Karen Ziegler has over 30 years of experience in criminal justice, program administration, budget and finance, and full life cycle grant management. Retired in 2016 as Deputy Director and Chief Financial Officer of the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission, Ms. Ziegler was responsible for the acquisition, subaward, management, and reporting for over $50 million in federal, state, and not-for-profit grants. In addition to financial management, Ms. Ziegler managed the Arizona Project Safe Neighborhoods Grant Program, a federal gun and gang violence prevention program, where she was responsible for the state's strategic approach to reducing gun and gang violence in Arizona. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our friends and partners for helping with this webinar. Today's presentation has been done in partnership with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. They are a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, also known as IBIS. IBIS is designed to find the needle in the haystack by discovering matches between pairs of spent bullets and cartridge cases at speeds well beyond human capacity. Forensic technology helps experts obtain timely information so they can make society a safer place. The last few things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, the event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It will be available on the Justice Clearinghouse website and Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology website later today. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions that you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and both Jim and Karen will take as many of your questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Next, if you experience audio issues during the webinar, such as the sound cutting in and out intermittently, consider dialing in using the phone number included in your emailed invite. When the system asks for a PIN, just hit the pound key. We do have several polling questions incorporated into this webinar. You'll need access to your keyboard and mouse to participate. And just by way of a try run, I'd actually like to ask the first question, which is, if the Justice Clearinghouse were to expand the number of webinars and webinar times that we have available in any given week, which of the following options would end up working the best for you? Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern, Fridays at 1 p.m. Eastern, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 Eastern, and Tuesdays and Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern. And while we're waiting for folks to go ahead and submit their thoughts on that, do note all of the time zones are Eastern time zone. So for example, if you're on the West Coast, you would end up subtracting 3 hours. And we'll go ahead and close the poll results, and thank you so much for participating. By far the winner with 51% is Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern, which is very consistent with the results from other webinars. I did want to point out that Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology has made a great tip sheet for successful grants available to you through the GoToWebinar toolbar under Handouts. I would highly encourage you to download it. And then as usual, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps shape pretty much everything that we do here at the Clearinghouse. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to our instructors for today. Jim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. On average, 39 firearm-related homicides per day in the United States. You don't hear the politicians or the media discussing that statistic, but that's what our nation's law enforcement officers deal with on a daily basis. Next slide. How about the annual cost of firearm violence? The latest statistics estimate the cost at $229 billion a year. As you can see on the map, the darker color, the higher the cost. Next slide. Crime gun violence is a nationwide issue that requires a nationwide network to effectively address this issue. When it comes to ballistic imaging, the Integrated Ballistic Identification System, or IBIS, is the only technology available for use on ATF's National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN. IBIS is a sole source technology when connected to NIBIN. Basically, IBIS is the technology, NIBIN is the program. Next. We've identified 8 components that make up an effective and sustainable preventive crime gun strategy. NIBIN is the cornerstone. NIBIN is a program that generates actionable leads, linking shooting crimes and incidents that otherwise may not have been linked. It allows investigators to obtain critical information in a timely manner, maximizing their ability to solve investigations. Most importantly, because it's a national network, it can be leveraged across jurisdictional boundaries. It currently links over 200 sites and 5,700 law enforcement agencies in the United States. If necessary, it can be linked to agencies internationally, as there are 70 sites in over 70, as there are sites in over 70 countries. Next slide. The ultimate goal in developing a crime gun strategy is to develop processes that will give investigators actionable crime gun intelligence within 48 hours of an offense. In doing this, the investigator will be placed in an advantageous position of being able to disrupt crime as opposed to simply reacting to criminal events. This allows for the very real potential of removing active shooters from the streets before they can reoffend, thereby making our community safer. Next slide. In 2017, over $700 billion of grant money was awarded to various agencies and organizations through the many departments of the federal government. That doesn't include grants from foundations or other private organizations. Obtaining these funds to purchase equipment in order to develop crime gun strategies is critical for law enforcement agencies. I will now turn it over to Karen Ziegler for the discussion on how to obtain these funds. Karen?
Thank you, Jim and Aaron. And before I get started, Aaron, let's do an audience poll question.
Absolutely. The polling question is open, and this is a great question. At what level would you categorize yourself as a grant writer? Do you consider yourself a beginner, intermediate, or are you more experienced? And the reason this information is so important is it allows Karen to kind of adjust her presentation based on the relative levels of experience in the room. And we'll give folks just about another 5 seconds to respond here. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Karen, 76% of the audience indicated they see themselves as a beginner grant writer, 14% indicated intermediate, and 11% experienced. And back to you.
Oh, great, Aaron. That is Perfect. And so I'm hoping that this presentation will give everyone some good tips, and I'll make sure that I explain some of the basic components of the grant a little bit more in depth, since we do have quite a few beginners on the webinar today. So for the grant writing portion, what we're going to talk about is funding opportunities and resources, getting started by reviewing the solicitation, developing the team and the timeline, writing the actual proposal, submitting the final product, the review process, and then we'll wrap it up with some grant resources to help you search, review, and write grants. So let's start by taking a look at the different types of grants that are available. We are all most familiar with federal grants, but there are a couple different types of federal grants. The first one is a grant, just a plain grant. This is an award, typically from a federal government, that awards funds to a recipient and where the funder has very little interaction or influence over the project. There's also cooperative agreements. And in the federal government cooperative agreement grants, the federal government partner actually partners with the recipient and plays an active role in how that project is implemented and managed. So a lot of times the federal granting agency will require you to get prior approval before you implement certain aspects of a project. Then there's a discretionary and formula grants. Discretionary funds are usually competitive grants, and they're usually one-time funding, either seed funding or, like I said, just one-time funding for equipment and other items. And there's also formula grants. Formula grants are typically funds that are awarded to states as a block grant to that state. And those states then will distribute those funds to local agencies, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So like I said, there's state government grants, and a lot of times state governments will pass through federal funds through what we call state administrating agencies, or SAAs. These agencies will subaward to eligible recipients. Each state has an SAA for specific types of grants. There will be a public safety or criminal justice SAA, a health agency, an education agency. So state agencies can also get funding from their state legislative appropriations process or special revenue funds that are dedicated to a specific purpose that these state agencies will then distribute to local and nonprofit agencies. So I recommend that you look up the SAA in your state and see what kind of programs that they fund. We also have other government grants from cities and counties. And for an example, in Arizona, we have an anti-racketeering funds program, or what we call RICO funds. The county attorneys in Arizona administer these funds, and some of the larger counties award grants to local agencies and nonprofits. Also, some tribes are a good resource for grant opportunities. Many tribes award grants to law enforcement using proceeds from their Indian gaming revenue. Foundations can be an excellent source of grant funds. There are hundreds of foundations ready to give money out. Many of these have less restrictions than government grants, and in some cases, these are less competitive. Lastly, look at private funders and corporate grants. Walmart, Petco, and many large corporations grant funds to their local communities. But for all of these sources, look at the mission of the organization before you invest in writing a proposal to that particular organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So we identified several types of grants. Now let's look at where we can find them. For federal grants, grants.gov is the one-stop shop for the federal grants. You can search, apply, receive notifications from this site. But not all federal agencies are using grants.gov at this time. U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance has a couple grants that you have to apply directly to their site. So it's good to check out the different agency sites. PoliceGrantsHelp.com is also another site that's supported by Police One magazine, and it's a great resource for law enforcement specific grants. As we mentioned, the state administrating agencies, they're a great resource. They'll list many of the grant opportunities at the state level on their sites, and a lot of times they'll list the federal opportunities as well. As we mentioned, there's an SAA in each state, so look them up. There are several foundation websites available. We've listed the link here to them. So like I said, you can look at individual foundations, or you can find a search engine that will pull them all up for you. There's several search engines out there. Some of them are free and some of them are paid subscriptions. eCivis is a great tool to be able to filter different types of grants that you're looking for. They're all pretty good, but like I said, find one that you can filter, because otherwise you'll get hundreds of emails a day for grants that you're not interested in. One thing I would like to encourage everyone is to think outside the box when you're searching for grants. For example, gun violence has been deemed a public health issue. So look at public health grants through the Department of Health and Human Services to help fight your crime reduction strategies. Also, the opioid crisis impacts law enforcement, victims, courts, detention, and a variety of other different disciplines. So you may want to partner with another agency on a grant proposal. It's a win-win for both, and the funder will really appreciate the collaboration and the innovative approach. Stuck. There we go. Okay, so how do we make grant writing easy? The logic model here shows a very simple process. Give us money, and we all win. Okay, it's not that easy, but hopefully this webinar will give you some good tools to help assist you in writing a grant. So I want to start out and talk about some key terms. So a solicitation is really just a request for proposal, RFP, or an RFGA, which means a request for grant application. And it's also the same thing as a notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO. Some federal agencies refer to that as a NOFA, a notice of funding availability. But basically, they all mean the same. And it's a term that the funder uses on announcing the funding that's available. An application is the same thing as a proposal or a funding request, and that's basically what you're doing, submitting to that funder. And a grant is the same thing as a funded project, which is the same thing as an award. So why should we seek grant funding? Grant funding is typically used for planning efforts, pilot projects, research and evaluation, to augment our staffing, or to purchase equipment like the NIBIN equipment that Jim talked about earlier. Typically, grants cannot be used for general agency operations, overhead, or lobbying and political activities. Here's a list of some common grants that are available for gun violence reduction strategies. Project Safe Neighborhoods is a very popular grant. These grants are awarded to the SAAs or a fiscal agent in a U.S. Attorney's Office district through the approved fiscal agent process. So local agencies cannot apply directly to the federal Project Safe Neighborhoods grant, but they can apply to the U.S. Attorney's Office districts through the approved fiscal agent for sub-awards of those PSN dollars. There's also the Crime Gun Intelligence Center, or CGIC grant. So here is the website for the Crime Gun Intelligence Center. It's got a lot of very helpful information, and then also a link to the BGA site for CGIC Integration Initiative. This is a partnership with ATF, and there's a lot of good resources on those websites about how to set up a CGIC in your community. The next one is Strategies for Policing Innovation, or the SPI grant. There's the most recent solicitation link there, and there's also a website specifically for the SPI program. And the last link is just a list of the 2019 solicitations that BJA put out for law enforcement in general. So it's got a list of all the grants, and it's a helpful tool to see what's out there for 2019. So let's get started. So before we put pen to paper or your fingers to your keyboard, we need to make sure that we know what we're looking at. We need to review the solicitation, review it several times, use a highlighter to mark up the key sections and the requirements. First, we need to make sure, are we eligible to apply for the grant? And eligibility is usually up at the front of the solicitation, and we're going to take a look at a solicitation here in a minute. The solicitation will usually include the program purpose or the agency mission. Now, keep in mind, this is the funder's mission, not your mission. Your project should align with the mission or the purpose of the funder. Think of it this way. How is your project going to help the funder achieve its goals? Also look at the requirements for collaboration. Is a 2 or more agency partnership required, or are they looking for a regional approach? Is it a multidisciplinary grant, meaning are you required to have a law enforcement partner and a community organization? Or in the early example, is it law enforcement and public health? If it's not required, is it preferred? These projects will receive higher consideration from the funder because they are innovative and collaborative. Funders like to see regional and multidisciplinary proposals. One of the things you need to consider in the collaboration with your partner is, what is that partner's role going to be? And are you prepared to work with that partner through the life of the grant? Also, is there a research partner required? Project Safe Neighborhoods has a very strong research component, and you should have a research partner as part of that grant. Some grants even require a specific amount to be budgeted to that partner. But don't let these requirements scare you away from applying for these grants. We'll talk a little bit more about how to do the research and evaluation a little later in the webinar. Another thing to look at is if there's match or cost sharing requirement. Is it in kind or a hard cash match? Make sure you have the resources to meet that match requirement. And this sometimes takes prior approval before you submit the proposal. So go ahead and plan ahead and talk with your finance folks whether you can meet those match requirements. Next, check out the scoring criteria. Most solicitations will publish how they allocate points to each section of the proposal. This is important, especially if you're crunched for time. Don't spend all your effort on writing a section that's only worth 5% of the total points available. Focus on the areas that carry the most points and make sure those sections are solid. Terms and conditions are also part of the solicitation. This may be dry, but it's very important, and this could eliminate your eligibility for a grant if you don't follow this section. Make sure you can meet these requirements. For example, federal grants have strict civil rights requirements that require you to designate a civil rights point of contact, and also that you have to have written procedures in place to handle any civil rights complaint. Also look at any technical requirements that may be part of the solicitation. Many technology awards will require you to be compatible with certain technology standards such as NEED. So verify you can meet all these requirements before you apply for a grant. So part of the technical, page limitations and formatting requirements, this is part of the solicitation, and it may seem petty, but as a grant reviewer, I'm telling you this is pretty important. If you can't follow simple instructions, then how are you going to be managing a project? If the solicitation says 12-page maximum, 12-point font, 1-inch margins, the reviewers will look at that and they'll know if you stretch the margins or you've gone over the page limit. And like I said, it's just the ability to follow instructions is important. Last is the due date. This is probably the most important. Make sure that you can meet the due date requirement of the grant. Mark it on your calendar, highlight it, put a sticky tape on your desk, but make sure you have plenty of time to go through the process and you can submit it on time. Okay, we're going to take a look at a solicitation for the SPI grant, and I am going to click on the link, and Aaron, it's going to work. Ta-da!
Huzzah!
So let's see. And I promise I'll try not to make you dizzy as I flip through this, but I wanted to show you an actual solicitation so you can point out, or I can point out some of the things that you need to be aware of. So this is the first page of the SPI grant, and right up front it has the due date and the eligibility requirements. So you need to read that first, make sure you can meet the due date, and that you're eligible to apply for the grant. Here's some information about the deadline and how to apply. There's a table of contents of all the different sections of the solicitation. And here's the program description. When I talked about the mission of the organization, this talks about what the mission of the SPI grant is, what the grant funds are to be used for. This grant has purpose areas, and there's some specific requirements about the 2 purpose areas that are in the solicitation. Then here is the federal award information. This tells you that they're going to, purpose area 1, they're going to have 5 awards up to $700,000 each. And purpose area 2, there'll be 2 awards for $500,000 each. And how much is available? It also tells you how long that grant period of performance will be, which is 36 months, and when it begins. There's also some special conditions that are listed in this section. So you remember when we talked about the different types of grants, there's grants and cooperative agreements. Under type of award, it says BJA expects to make awards under the solicitation in the form of a grant. So there's no cooperative agreement for this one. And then in the budget information section, it talks about cost sharing and match. And this grant does not require a match. We have a lot of the technical requirements that are here. I think the solicitation is like 45 pages long, so you really need to read through all of it. This is the application and submission information. And this section says you need to complete what's called a SF 424. It's basically the federal government's application form. This is built into a lot of the electronic systems, but in some cases, this may be a separate attachment. So this section here talks about the project abstract and the program narrative. We're going to go through this in detail in the webinar, but I just wanted to make you available or make you aware of that. And here we have the budget section. This is a budget detail worksheet and a budget narrative. Both of these are required. And there is also an indirect cost agreement that's part of your budget. We'll talk about that as well. And if you're a tribe, there is tribal issues or tribal forms that you need to complete. This here is a internal controls questionnaire that all applicants have to fill out. And then here are some of the lobbying activity disclosures. This one is, do you have any pending applications for the same type of project? So the federal agency can ensure that they're not, double funding a particular project. This grant requires some additional attachments. They're all listed here. It also requires a timeline and letters of support and some other disclosures, as well as resumes. This section here is how to apply. Like we said, most of the federal grants are through grants.gov, but this takes a registration process. And sometimes if you haven't applied to grants.gov in the past, it will take several weeks to get that process set up. So you'll have to start early. And you don't have to wait until a grant is open to register for grants.gov. So I would suggest that if you're not registered, you go ahead and do that. Here's some formatting. Again, that's the registration process. Now here, this section is really important. This is the review criteria, or the scoring criteria. As I talked about before, don't spend all your time on a section that's only worth 5% of the overall score. And in this particular grant, this probably design and implementation is worth 30%, and the capabilities and competencies, as well as the data section, are worth 25% each. So focus your time on the sections that are going to hold the most weight. And in this case, the budget is worth 10%. So this is legal requirements for the grant. Other information. And here is an appendix for the application checklist. This is really helpful to make sure that you've got all the pieces of the application together before you submit. So, and there's a couple samples and some other federal requirements. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. And now we're going to talk about how to set up your grant writing team. Now we know what grant we're going to apply for, so how do we go about doing it? So I recommend the first team member that you you get is a technical or a SME, a subject matter expert. This could be a scientist, a clinician, a technician, an IT person, someone that can help you with the technical requirements that we talked about, whether it is the project or, you know, an IT integration effort. Next is your research, folks. We talked a little bit about this before. This will be your research partner if required, but even if it's not required, it's a good idea to have someone that can gather and interpret the data and statistics to help you as you set up the evaluation of your project. If you don't have anyone in-house, reach out to your university, your community college, or your SAA for assistance. Every state has what's called a Statistical Analysis Center, or a SAC, that's funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Many of these SACs are willing to help you with your research activities. Next is the budget. And these are the money folks. Get your finance, your payroll, your HR folks to help you with costing items needed for the budget. These people can help you with salaries, fringe benefit calculations, and job descriptions that may be required as part of the submission. They will understand how to fully load your personnel cost to make sure that you account for any step increases that your agency has, or any startup equipment needs like a computer or a cell phone and things like that. Next is the editing. You need a good editor to help review your proposal. Trust me, after you've looked at something 1,000 times, you will read what you want it to say and you'll miss things. I recommend getting someone that is not part of the project, like your PIO or your communications person, to QA the proposal. If they don't know anything about the project and the proposal makes sense to them, then you've done a good job explaining it. Last is the approval process. Who has to approve this proposal before you submit it? Your chief, your executive director, your CIO? Does it have to go before a city council or another body for approval? This all takes time, so make sure you plan accordingly. So that's a great segue into our next section, which is developing the timeline. First, you need to create that schedule. I like to start with the due date and work backwards. Give yourself a cushion of at least a day before the date to submit. Something always comes up, so plan ahead. If you have letters of support that are required, ask for these right up front. Drafting the letters or providing a template that includes the grant you're applying for, a summary of the project, and the relationship you have with the supporting agency is very helpful and appreciated of those agencies. Remember, they may have an approval process as well, so give them time. Build in time for multiple drafts. It's helpful to create an outline to keep everyone on track. Allow time for your data and your budget people to get you what you need. This grant probably isn't their only project, nor is it their first priority, so they will need time to give you that information. And plan time for approvals, as we discussed. Allow time for the review, because a rushed proposal will be noticed by the funder. And submit early. If you're applying on grants.gov, keep in mind that the rest of the country is applying as well. The system can get bogged down and you may not be able to submit. Also remember that grants.gov require you to register before you submit, and this is a several step process, so make sure that you have time to do that or else you will not be able to submit your grant. Think of these steps as a project management exercise. Document each step, who is responsible and when it's due. Keep a shared calendar so everyone can stay on track, and touch base with your team frequently and address any issues right away. So Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you. We have another poll question here.
Absolutely. And that polling question is open. I love this question. What is your greatest concern about writing a grant? Do you not have enough time? Is there a basic lack of subject matter expertise that you're worried about? Or are you mostly worried about managing the grant once you receive it? And we'll give folks just about another 10 seconds to respond, Karen. I am curious, Karen, in your expertise, which one of these three tends to be the most concerning aspect for people you've worked with?
I think in today's environment, really just not enough time. And we're going to talk about a couple tips on how to put things in place and have kind of an off-the-shelf project so you're not writing it in the last 2 weeks before it's due.
Got it. Yep, I can certainly understand that, especially with the understaffing a lot of agencies are experiencing. So the tallies are in, Karen. 53% of the audience indicated that they're concerned about a lack of subject matter expertise. 27% indicated the same as what you just said, not enough time, with 19% indicated that they're worried about managing the grant. And back to you.
Okay. And that's good to know that a lot of people are concerned with not having the subject matter expertise. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of resources out there, and we'll go over a few other sites that may help them in that area. Okay, so now it's time to start writing. So I wanted to start off with some styles of writing. We've heard of active writing and passive writing, constrained writing, fragmented writing, rewriting, and persuasive writing. I'm curious if any of you resemble any of those styles. I certainly think that at some point I've resembled all of those styles. A couple things to keep in mind, some general writing tips that you need to keep in mind when you're writing your proposal. Some of the do's are use short and simple sentences. You know, break up those long run-on sentences. Use action verbs like active voice and action verb words. Use third person. Don't use we and I. And avoid jargon. Some of the don'ts are don't use long, complex sentences. Don't use passive voice. Don't use excessive acronyms. And if you're going to use acronyms, spell it out once the very first time you use it, then use your acronym or your abbreviation and use that through the rest of your document. And don't self-indict. And what this means is that don't tell your funder what you can't do or where your shortfalls are. Your funder knows that you have a gap, and that's why you're applying for grants. So you want to focus on what you're going to do with those funds to improve your program. Okay, let's take a look at what's required in the proposal. The abstract is usually listed first in the solicitation, but I recommend you write this last. An abstract is just a summary of the proposal. It's like an executive summary in a report. It's usually published and made viewable to the public, and the abstract usually includes the project title, information about the organization, a brief description of the project, the amount you're requesting, and the goals and objectives. You can see why it's easier to write the abstract after you finish the proposal, because all you have to do is take a couple of key sentences from each of the sections and use it in the abstract. Now we're going to talk about the problem statement. Here's where we need to identify the problem. Ask yourself, what are we trying to solve? Not having enough money or staff is not the problem. In this case, gun violence reduction is the problem that we're trying to solve. And we're going to do that with money and staffing that we'll talk about in a little bit. Collect data to support your claim. You need to prove why this is a problem. This is where you bring in your research folks. Use local data and make comparisons to the national average or neighboring jurisdictions. Use rates or percentages with actual counts. I'll show you why this is important. So say I have 1 homicide last year and I have 2 homicides this year. I have a 100% increase in homicides, but do I really have a problem? Your reviewers and your funders are going to look at this data to make sure that you've identified the problem and there really is a problem that exists. Next, what are the consequences if we do not address this problem? If you've tried things and they failed, include this in the problem statement. Don't be tempted to talk about how you're going to fix your problem here. Save that for the next section. So here are some good resources for statistical data. We mentioned earlier the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and here's the link. There's also many cities that have stats readily available on their website. The Uniform Crime Report is available, and also the Justice Research and Statistical Association, where the SACs are funded, have a lot of good information. Just make sure that you use reputable sources and you cite your statistics. So after you identify the problem, what are you going to do to solve it? This is called the project description, or sometimes the program design. Think of it as the who, what, where, when, and how of your project. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? Where is it going to take place? Who are the key personnel and who are we serving? And when is it going to happen? This is your project timeline. If you're not sure of your program design or your project description, there are some great resources out there to help. Crimesolutions.gov has a library of evidence-based programs that have proven results that you can follow to address your program. For example, you know your community has an opioid problem, but you don't know the best way to address it. Look at the existing evidence-based programs in the library and see which one fits your needs and model your program after that. So now we're going to talk about the goals, objectives, and performance measures. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the SMART model. Goals should be specific, measurable, achievable or actionable, realistic or relevant, and time-bound. I like to think of it as an upside-down pyramid, broader on the top, focusing to a point at the bottom. Goals describe the broader purpose, while objectives are more defined, the who will do, how much of what, by when. Performance measures are what we're going to count or track to see if we achieved our desired outcome. Here's an example. The goal is to decrease gun crime by employing a research-driven, intelligent-led, strategic problem-solving approach to reducing firearms crimes and gang violence by implementing a NIBIN program in the state. Pretty broad. The objective is to test and enter all new seized firearms into NIBIN within 48 hours. And how we're going to measure that is by the percent of firearms entered or casings entered into NIBIN within that 48-hour period. And by doing a percentage, we can see, are we doing 10%, are we doing 50%, and we can measure how successful we're going to be. So let's spend a few more minutes on performance measures. Grantors want to see results. Reporting on performance measures is the new norm, and every grant is going to ask for that. So the definition of a performance measure is a regular measurement of outcomes and results, which generates reliable data on the effectiveness and efficiency of your program. Performance measures can be qualitative, which is non-numeric, like the quality of life. This could be a survey response on how someone feels. Do you feel safe in your community? Quantitative is the number or degree of change. And then usually they're reported as outputs, which can be number of officers trained, number of advocates hired, or they could be outcomes, which is change in knowledge, behavior, or skill. Next, we're going to talk about capabilities and competencies. This is basically a resume of your organization. The funder wants to know your experience and your ability to carry out the project. You should include previous grants that you've received and how that grant was managed. Include any positive outcomes from previous awards, and also include your partner's qualifications and experience. Last, include your research partner's qualifications if you have a research partner assigned to the grant. This could be a off-the-shelf, ready-to-go section for any proposal. You don't have to wait until a grant announcement is opened to put this section together. This should be something that you can, for your organization, you can just update personnel and you can cut and paste in your partner, but you should have something like this ready to go so you're not trying to write it with all the other sections of the grant. So the next section we're going to talk about is the budget. The budget tells the funder how much it's going to cost you to run your project. Think of the budget as your financial plan for the project. There's typical budget categories that are pretty standard across both federal and state solicitations, and that's personnel or salaries, fringe benefits, which sometimes are called employee-related expenses, consulting and contracts, supplies, equipment, and other. Others typically can be indirect costs or, some overhead like rent, the rent or telephone cost. We're going to show you an example of a budget here in a minute. You need to understand what is allowable and what is prohibited under the grant. These are usually spelled out in the solicitation or the supporting document. Don't ask for things that are not allowable. Make sure your budget ties to your project. Are you asking for items that are not addressed in the project description? For example, are you asking for salary and fringe benefits for 3 technicians, but you only said you needed 2 to process the cases in the project description? This might seem like it's common sense, but trust me, this happens regularly. And it also goes the other way. If you say you're going to do all this work in the project description, but you're not asking for sufficient funding, the reviewer is going to question how you're going to be able to accomplish your goal. Make sure your match calculations are correct, and we'll look at some match calculations as well here, but clearly identify whether it's in-kind or cash match and the source of the match. If you're including indirect costs, make sure you have an approved indirect cost rate or plan. Recent changes to the federal guidelines has loosened up this requirement, but make sure you're working with your finance folks to make sure that you're including the appropriate rate if you have one. So keep in mind, expenses must be allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary. Expenses of federal funds must be treated the same way as other funds in your organization. And a good example of this is travel expenses. The federal government has a travel reimbursement rate, but if your city or state has a different rate, you can't treat the federal grant dollars differently than the state grant dollars. So whatever your state policy has, you use that even if it's lower than the federal rate. And that also pertains to salaries as well. So let's talk a little bit more about match. Match or cost sharing is your portion of the total project added to the federal award. There's typically two kinds of match: in-kind contributions and cash match. In-kind contributions means the value of non-cash contributions, either property or services, that benefit a federally assisted project or program and are contributed by a non-federal party without charge. So a good example of in-kind is volunteer hours or free space that an organization has given to you to provide your service. The value of that is an in-kind contribution. On the other hand, a cash match means the actual cash paid by the applicant for a service or product. And keep in mind that you can't use match for multiple grants. It can only match one grant, and it must be from a non-federal source. So let's take a look at how to calculate match. The first example shows a 25% match, and it's pretty straightforward. 75% of the project is supported by the grant, and 25% is supported by you. The total award is $100,000. The second example shows a 10% match. 90% of the project is supported by the grant, and 10% is supported by you. Notice that in both these examples, the match is calculated on the total project cost. It is not the percentage of the federal amount. So it's easy to see in the 90-10 category, if you did 10% of the grant, it would only be $6,300, but the actual match required is $7,000. So make sure you calculate that correctly. So we're going to take a look at a budget detail and narrative template. Okay. So here, the budget detail and the narrative is combined. If you look in the personnel section, right down here at the bottom is the narrative. Sometimes the federal agency will require two separate documents, but just follow this solicitation and make sure that you provide the template that they're looking for. So let's take a look and review these categories here. So personnel is the salaries. They're asking for the name or the position of the person you're requested funding for, the computation, whether it's 100% or a fraction of that person's time, and the cost. This is the total cost, which would include the match. Fringe benefits, as I said, is the employee-related expenses. Also, make sure that you include that calculation and you list the different components of that fringe benefit. Travel, if there's any in-state or out-of-state travel that's required, put the different components of airfare, hotel, and meals. based on your policies of your limits. Keep in mind that some grants actually require you to attend a training or a regional conference, so make sure you include that in the budget. There's an equipment section, and the federal government actually has a $5,000 threshold. So if it's under $5,000, put it in the supply category. So if it's like a laptop or something, you can put it in the supply category. But if you're applying for the NIBIN equipment, then that certainly would be in equipment. And there's supplies. Any construction costs, and consultants and contracts. For this section, there's a requirement that the consultant fees cannot be in excess of $250 per day, which I don't know if anyone's hired consultants lately, but that's pretty low. But if you have a state contract or a city contract with a that's been competitively approved through an RFP process that's higher than that, you just need to supply that particular contract with your grant application to show that you've had a competitive process. Other costs that we talked about was like rent and telephone and reproduction costs, and then indirect costs. So the last section here is just a summary of all the different categories, and as you can see, there's a total direct cost of $379,000. There's indirect cost for total project cost, and then the last two are the breakdown between the federal request and the match or the non-federal request. All right. So the next section of the grant proposal is the evaluation. So let's discuss how and why we need to evaluate our project. So why do we need to do that? We need to determine if we're successful. And we need to determine the return on investment, if what we put into the project was worth the money that we spent. In some cases, you'll have a formal research partner, as we discussed, or you could have an internal research department that will help you. It's really important to have good data at the beginning of the project, during the project, and after the project is over. The baseline data will help you measure the change, as we talked about with the performance measure. In a good evaluation process, you should review your data, analyze the effect, and revise your project accordingly. A lot of people have the misconception that you always have to show positive results. This really is not true. Sometimes we learn more about learn more from what didn't go so well as what actually worked. So be honest about your results. It will help you and the funder understand what worked and what didn't. So the next section is the program sustainability. Yes, I know we're getting to the end of the proposal. We're running out of time, so this section usually suffers, but almost every grant will require you to submit a sustainability plan. And remember, most grants are seed money. The expectation is that you will continue efforts after the grant is over. So how do you do that if you don't have any money, right? Remember when we talked about making sure you could meet the requirements of the solicitation? Well, this is one of them. You should have a plan to continue your efforts, even if it's not set in stone. Identify other funding sources that you may be able to use. You could use savings from efficiencies that you've realized because of your grant work to pay for the ongoing costs or personnel. You can write in ongoing costs into your general operating budget. You can submit a budget request for legislative appropriation. You can look to partnerships to help support ongoing efforts. So just keep in mind that the funder wants to know that you're not going to close up shop once the grant goes away. Okay, we're ready to submit the proposal. So there are some common attachments that we saw in the solicitation that we reviewed. the organization chart. If you've identified personnel in the project description that you need to make sure that you add them to the org chart. This is true for new positions. So you need to include those proposed positions, and you can indicate them by a dotted outline or a different color and just specify that those are your proposed positions. You need to provide a list of key personnel and their resumes. Include those letters of support that you've been working on. Include any required certifications, a bibliography if necessary, and anything else that the solicitation requires. And that's where it's helpful to go back to that checklist. So here are a couple of tips for your final review of your proposal. Ensure you tell the whole story. What is the problem? What are you going to do about it? And how are you going to know if you've made an impact? Use clear and concise language. Use third person. Don't use we and I. Spell out those acronyms. Check your spelling and grammar. And this is where your editor comes in. Make sure all your sections tie together. The project design must address the problem you're trying to solve. The budget supports the project as you described it. And the evaluation shows the outcomes of your effort. And check your numbers. It's common to tweak things at the last minute, so go back and make sure you updated all those sections. And make sure that that budget narrative ties back to the project. Again, use that checklist to make sure you met all those requirements. So here's a sample checklist. This was taken from one of the solicitations. I recommend you refer back to the solicitation to make sure that you have all of those items in your proposal. So you submitted the application, now what? So I wanted to just spend a few minutes going over the review process. There's a review. The first initial review is called the Basic Minimum Requirements Review. And this is designed to eliminate ineligible applicants. Make sure that you meet all of those eligibility requirements. You remember there in one of the solicitations we looked at, they had an asterisk of a critical component that was identified. If you didn't meet that, that would eliminate you from the review process. So next is the peer review. A lot of federal agencies use external peer reviewers. They're subject matter experts that understand the issue. They use external reviewers to hopefully reduce the review bias. But keep in mind, these people know the projects, and they'll know whether you've copied a proposal from another state, or, you know, one of the things I get asked a lot is, can I share proposals for successful grants? And typically we don't do that. One, because it's proprietary to the agency, and the other is that these reviewers, they'll know if you're copying a proposal, you know, from another area. So, and then the budget review process, making sure those costs are reasonable, necessary, allocable to the proposed project. So these are some of the red flags that you need to be aware of. Make sure that you don't have excessive and unjustified expenses. Most of those will be in that area of personnel costs, travel costs, consulting fees, and equipment that we talked about. And also be careful of supplanting. Supplanting is defined as federal funds that are used in place of state or local funds for the same activity. For example, if you received an appropriation to buy equipment and then you got a federal grant for the same purpose, and you decided to take your state money and spend it somewhere else and use the federal money, that's considered supplanting. So, and lastly, with the review process, after the grant has been submitted and awarded, if you did not get the award, and even if you did get the award, I recommend that you request the reviewer's comments and feedback. Most federal and state agencies willingly will provide those written comments. And if they don't have written comments, a lot of times the program advisor will do a one-on-one call with you and let you know how you did on your proposal. This will be very helpful for you if you didn't get the award, how you can improve your proposal for the next round. So here are some helpful sites that will be available in the presentation slides. I won't go over them specifically. And also some resources that are available through forensic technology, and I believe Aaron said that those are available as handouts. The website for forensic technology is up there, so there is some other additional resources for you. So I hope this was informative for all of you today, and there was some helpful tips for every skill level. If we have some questions, I'm happy to answer that, and I apologize, Aaron, for going over a little bit.
No worries. I don't think anyone's going to complain about sharing more than an hour worth of best practices on grant proposals, especially given your background, Karen, and your expertise in them. Thank you both, Jim and Karen, for sharing such incredible information today. I really appreciated, Karen, what you said about not self-indicting in the proposal process with things you're concerned. And I got to say, Elena just actually messaged over and she said, no complaints about going along. I love her. So love having you here, Karen. Folks, if you have any questions for Jim or Karen, please do feel free to type them into the GoToWebinar toolbar. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is going to be made available to everyone at no cost. So just keep an eye on your email about that. We should have that ready to send out tomorrow. So keep an eye on your email tomorrow. Meanwhile, our next related webinar is scheduled for January 14th. The title is Beyond Strategic Planning, Creating a Community Crime Control Plan for Your Agency. And again, that's January 14th. If you want to sign up, go to the Justice Clearinghouse website. Go up to events and find that on our calendar on January 14th, and I hope to see you there. Karen, we have received a number of questions already. If you're ready, we can start going through those.
Okay, I'm ready.
Perfect. Our first question comes in from John. He said, under an SAA and as a subrecipient, what is the best way to request funding or find out if funding is available?
Great question, John. The SAAs, the state administrating agencies across the country, should all have a website. A lot of them have very formal grant programs, and so go to their website, look at when those grant announcements are made. Typically, they're pretty standard during that year, and then reach out to that program manager for that particular program. And you can sit down with them and they can give you, if it's not during the open solicitation, they can give you very specific ideas about how your project will meet their requirements.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes in from Anita. She asks, our agency has a policy that requires items to be put under the equipment category. However, OCFO wants them listed under supplies. Do you have a recommendation on how to deal with this difference?
Yeah, I've seen that happen a couple times, but keep in mind, you're applying for a federal grant. You need to follow the requirements of the federal funder. Now, by putting it in the application under supplies, doesn't mean that when you buy the equipment that you have to categorize it as supplies. You can record it as an asset in your accounting records. So maybe that would help with your local agency.
Got it. Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is from Alyssa. If we are submitting for a gun crime related grant, is Ultra able to assist in the grant submission process, or probably the grant proposal process is my guess?
Mhm. Uh, yes, definitely. I contract with Forensic Technologies to provide support to agencies that are looking to buy NIBIN equipment. So work with Jim or Brandon Huntley on if you're looking for a proposal, and they'll contact me and connect us.
Perfect. Karen, on that previous question, the one related to the equipment category and stuff, Anita just did write back. She said that the issue can become an indirect cost calculation problem, though. So I don't know if you had any additional comments on that, or if you could shed more light on that equipment categorization.
So it depends on how an indirect cost proposal is developed. If it is a direct cost of the project, then it shouldn't be part of the indirect cost calculation. But there's a variety of different ways that agencies put those proposals together. And sometimes they will reduce the total cost by the equipment, and I think maybe that's what she's referring to. Again, I think what you'll need to do is work with your finance people, and there could be a way to adjust your indirect cost proposal to account for that. And again, you need to file the federal, in accordance with the federal requirements, and they're in my experience, they're pretty strict about that equipment reporting category.
Got it. We have just a few more questions for you, Karen. The next one is from Nick. What are the most common reasons why grants aren't awarded?
I think the first one is that there's more requests than there's money available. And so sometimes it's just the competition that you faced in that particular cycle. You may have a great proposal, but there was just several other great proposals, and they needed to prioritize what they were going to fund. And that's why I suggested that if you don't get the award, you reach out to that that agency and ask for the comments. It could be that you just didn't identify the problem, or the project did not identify how you were going to solve that problem. Or like I said, it could just be that there was a very competitive process.
Got it. Our next question is from John. Are you aware of any grant proposal writing software or templates that we might be able to use?
Great question. I'm not aware of a grant writing software, but there are several templates that are out there. And what I usually do for the grants that I work on with the different agencies, I take the solicitation, and you saw that table of contents, I pull out those sections and then write in some key elements that need to be included in that section. But the solicitations are a pretty good guide on how to develop that proposal. And I suggest you actually use those headings in your proposal.
Got it. Great. Great advice there. Our last question comes in from Elizabeth. What is meant by the term cooperative agreement in a grant?
I'm sorry, Aaron, could you repeat that?
Sure. Elizabeth is asking, what is meant by the term cooperative agreement in a grant?
Okay. So at the beginning of the webinar, we talked about different types of grants, and the federal government will award a basic grant that has very little oversight from the federal agency. You still have the reporting requirements, but you're responsible for putting that project together and how you're going to execute the grant for your project. And a cooperative agreement is very different. It is a partnership with the federal agency. So the federal government will work with you to develop the project. They will have a lot more oversight. You know, for example, if you were going to do subawards, they may require you get those subawards approved before you make those awards. And then like your evaluation process, they may work directly with you on developing the evaluation criteria.
Understand. Karen, thank you so much for great responses and to our audience for asking great questions. Before we close out, Jim, Karen, I want to give you guys an opportunity for any closing remarks.
Oh, just that if anybody would, like to further discuss this, please contact us. You have our contact information. We're available anytime to provide you with information and answer your questions.
And I just want to thank everybody for their time. I hope this was a good use of your time. And again, I am available. My contact information is there if I can answer any more questions.
Great. Again, thank you both very much. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your week. Bye now.
Thank you.